In the past couple of years, many independent journalists have found themselves paying a high price simply for doing their job. No one more well known than Mohamed Fahmy. A former Al Jazeera bureau chief in Cairo, Fahmy found himself convicted and imprisoned for terrorist charges. And after 2 years abroad in prison, he finally came home. In an RRJ exclusive, I spoke to Fahmy about the media coverage surrounding his case. Here at the RRJ, we like to watch the watchdog. So we're going to talk to Mohamed Fahmy on an exclusive interview for our website about the media coverage around his case and ask his opinion on what he thought was done well and what he found lacking. Thank you for being with us. So like I said, can you please talk to us about what you thought about the media coverage, both international and Canadian, about your arrest, your detention, your imprisonment, and everything else surrounding it? Did you think they did a good job?
Well, thank you so much for having me at RJ today. It just feels so good to be able to speak freely in Canada, in Toronto especially, and to be here on Thanksgiving. It's a perfect timing, and it wasn't planned, but that's the way it happened. No, I'm really thankful to the international community, the way they covered the case, especially that the case came at a time when ISIS was, peaking, and there was so much going on in the world, and the trouble in Ukraine and the airplanes. So basically, we did get very good coverage, and I'm grateful to all the journalists that made it possible for me to be here with you, and all the Canadians who tweeted and signed petitions. And I think that made a difference at the end when we were pardoned. It was all a collective effort that finally got to the Egyptian president, who decided to let us go. And I do believe that the rest of my colleagues who have not been pardoned should be pardoned, because as bureau chief, I was labeled as the main suspect in a trial that was bogus. Terrorism cases now are being used. This war on terror is being used to clamp down on our civil liberties, and we're seeing it in many countries, not just in Egypt. There's about 220 journalists behind bars. This year, unfortunately, 65 have already been killed. So, we really need to unite as journalists and as conscious citizens to continue to call for the release of others behind bars, to continue to call on governments to respect free speech and make sure that we are able to do our job safely and freely. And we also need to make sure that media organizations respect what it means for the safety of their journalists, and to make sure they have a security umbrella on the ground, because now we have become targets by both governments and by extremist groups. And there's almost no neutral place for us as journalists to operate, and this is becoming evident on the ground. And I'm very sad to see many of my friends whom I know have been killed, like Stephen Sotloff, for example. He came to my house before he went to Syria, and I watched his slaying in prison, and I was surrounded by jihadists.
But do you think the media's covered all the cases as well as yours, as well as they should have?
Our case specifically highlighted more than other cases how the media landscape of journalism now overlaps with politics, because our case wasn't just about freedom of expression. There was an aspect of the case that's very important that wasn't really covered well, which is the political score settling between Egypt and Qatar, the owner of Al Jazeera. And I think there could have been more coverage on that. But again, I do feel that the journalism community felt that they just wanted to fight for us and for our rights. But I had to take a different approach in court in our own defense, in making sure to separate between the responsibilities of the journalist and of the network. And that's a point that needs to be developed.
From a Canadian perspective, though, do you think the media coverage did enough to expose, say, the inaction of the government or the other elements of your case? Because your case was very complicated. It wasn't just that a journalist was banned for freedom of expression. There was more to it than that. But do you think that from a Canadian media standpoint or Canadian journalism standpoint, was it done well enough to expose all angles of the story?
I think the Canadian journalism community did an epic job. And many of the headlines here and the tweets were translated into Middle Eastern newspapers, and they made the headlines there. And that really supported me very much, because the watchdog approach, now the government in Egypt really knew that our story is being all over the press in Canada. And again, this watchdog approach also Mr. Harper was now very aware that the media is watching. And I do believe that that played a major role in the fact that I'm here with you today.
I want to ask you a question about your future as a journalist. I mean, you as a journalist are now the story. So how do you balance that out? Like, if now everything you do is going to be put in a spotlight because you are Mohamed Fahmy, you were the journalist who was convicted with terrorists in a high security prison. So moving forward, how do you deal with that? How do you balance being the story but also being a journalist with responsibilities to impartiality, objectivity, and all of that?
Well, it's obviously a very thin line, but I do believe it's a responsibility for me to use the platform I have now and that sort of spotlight to, again, highlight responsibilities of networks, governments, and fight for others. But it's very important to realize that if you've ever believed in journalism, if I ever believed in journalism, and I joined journalism to make a difference and protect others, this experience made it very clear of how important journalism is more than anything, because this is what kept my plight alive when I was in solitary confinement with no outing for 1 month, sleeping on the floor in a cold cell, and somehow through the cracks of that concrete jungle there were snippets of news that slipped in about petitions, and I knew that there was people fighting for me outside and my plight was being covered, and it wasn't just about me. So I do believe it's very, very important for me to reflect through you and others and who are still willing to give me the platform in discussing what's going on behind bars and other places there.
Well, we wish you luck for it, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here.